The silence in the house was a suffocating thing, heavier and colder than the December air outside. It had been 7 weeks since the funeral, but for Elias, the absence of his mother, Clara, still felt like an agonizing phantom limb. He walked through the familiar rooms, his footsteps echoing on the polished wood, each sound a stark reminder that only three of them remained: himself, his father Arthur, and his younger sister, Lily. Arthur, a man who had always worn his emotions like an impenetrable suit of armor, was crumbling. The grief had manifested in a quiet, disturbing withdrawal. He spent his days in his study, blinds drawn, poring over old blueprints and ledgers, pretending that the sheer volume of his work could drown out the pain. Lily, however, was loud in her sorrow. Her anger was a fiery, volatile thing, directed at everything and nothing. She believed the tragedy could have been prevented, and her resentment settled like ash over every family interaction, making reconciliation impossible. Elias, caught between the two, decided he needed to anchor his fractured family, to capture the memory of Clara before the sharp edges of their loss wore away entirely. He searched, not for a conventional photographer, but for someone who could capture not just faces, but feeling. His search led him down an obscure path on the internet to the portfolio of a man named Alastair Finch. Finch's work was unsettling portraits that seemed to breathe, faces that held secrets in their shadowed eyes, compositions that felt like scenes ripped from a dream. Consultation with Finch was bizarre. He met Elias in a dilapidated studio that smelled of dust and old chemicals. Finch himself was a frail man with hands stained with silver nitrate and eyes that seemed too large for his skull. He listened to Elias's request a single, final family photograph to commemorate Clara without blinking. He didn't offer sympathy, he offered a warning. He called his work a chemically imposed truth, claiming his antique camera didn't just capture light, it captured the essence of the moment. The unspoken tension, the deepest desires. Elias, desperate and naive, dismissed it as artistic eccentricity. He saw only the potential for beauty and paid Finch's exorbitant fee without hesitation. The day of the shoot arrived, bringing with it a forced, uncomfortable truce. Elias managed to coax Arthur and Lily into the living room, a space Clara had always kept pristine. Lily wore a dress too formal for the occasion, her eyes red-rimmed and challenging. Arthur was stiff, his posture rigid, his face a mask of worried patience. They were a shattered mosaic of a family, held together only by the fragile promise of this single shared act. Alastair Finch brought his equipment, a massive mahogany-view camera perched atop a heavy tripod, the lens looking like a single dark cyclopean eye. He spoke little, circling them, his movements precise and unsettling. He didn't range them. Naturally, he instructed them to sit exactly where they were, side by side on the old velvet sofa, an arrangement that forced them into proximity but highlighted their emotional distance. Finch then began a strange ritual. He draped the black cloth over his head, adjusting the focus. The silence in the room became agonizing. Elias watched his sister fidget, watched his father clench his jaw, and felt the familiar pressure of their mutual, unresolved hostility. Finch's voice was muffled from beneath the cloth when he finally spoke. He did not say smile or look here. He said, hold your secrets, hold your anger. It will be seen. The camera flashed not with a burst of bright light, but with a deep, pulsing internal glow, a warm amber light that seemed to emanate from within the frame, not from an external source. It was a slow, agonizing exposure. Elias felt the heat on his face, the air thick and charged, and for a terrifying second he thought he smelled ozone and something vaguely metallic. Like blood. Finch emerged, breathless, holding the large glass plate. He looked at the family with an expression of profound, exhausted pity. "It is done," he announced, gathering his equipment with startling speed. He explained that the print would take a week to process, insisting the unique chemistry required time to set. He warned Elias, his eyes wide and earnest, that this photograph was not a remembrance. It was a record, and once the record was made, the truth it captured could not be undone. Elias watched the eccentric artist leave, feeling a profound sense of relief that the ordeal was over. But relief soon turned to unease. He looked at the sofa where they had sat, and for a fleeting moment he saw the faint, reddish impression of three figures burn into the velvet cushion, as if their bodies had radiated intense heat. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, he turned to address his father and sister. But Arthur was already retreating to his study, and Lily had vanished up the stairs. The silence returned, yet now it was different. It felt watchful, expectant. Elias walked to the large bay window and stared out into the twilight, a growing, cold certainty settling in his gut. Something fundamental had changed in that room, and he had foolishly paid a stranger to seal their fate. He realized he hadn't created a memorial, he had opened a door. The week that followed the photograph session felt less like 7 days and more like a slow, deliberate suffocation. Elias found himself constantly checking the clock, counting down the hours until Alistair Finch would deliver the print. The air of unease that had settled over the house intensified, manifesting in small, baffling ways. Lights flickered erratically in the hallway where the portrait was intended to hang, and a pervasive, sweet, metallic scent, a scent that vaguely resembled the chemical used by Finch, began to cling to the walls of the living room. Lily's volatile anger seemed to be feeding on this atmosphere. She was convinced that the portrait was a pointless, artistic indulgence and that Elias was trying to whitewash their grief, instead of confronting the real, unspoken issues surrounding their mother's death. One evening, Elias walked past her bedroom and heard a strange, scratching sound coming from inside. He paused, listening intently. It was the frantic, repetitive sound of nails against wood. But when he knocked and asked if she was all right, the sound stopped instantly. Lily opened the door, her eyes wide and unnaturally dark, and simply said she was reorganizing her cedar chest. He believed her, but the scratching sound seemed to linger in the periphery of his hearing for the rest of the night. Arthur remained withdrawn, his study now a fortress of silence. Elias tried several times to breach the barrier, attempting to discuss the photograph, their mother, or anything that might draw his father out of his self-imposed prison. Each attempt was met with the same cold, distant dismissal. Yet Elias noticed something chilling. Arthur had started wearing the same charcoal suit every day, the same one he had worn for the photograph. It was immaculate, but the insistence felt obsessive, almost ritualistic. Finally, the day of the delivery arrived. Finch appeared at dusk, a dark, heavy shape against the falling snow, carrying a large, carefully wrapped package. His face was paler than before, and his hands, usually steady, trembled slightly. He accepted no refreshment and offered no pleasantries. He simply handed the package to Elias and offered a cryptic, final piece of advice: do not move them. Do not change the arrangement. The frame is the boundary. Respect it. Elias carried the package heavily framed and dark, unforgiving mahogany into the living room. Arthur emerged from his study, compelled by an invisible force, and Lily crept down the stairs, her resentment temporarily overshadowed by morbid curiosity. They unwrapped the photograph together, a moment of fragile unity amidst the house's deep discord. The photograph was not a simple picture. It was a revelation that it was undeniably them, yet terribly, beautifully wrong. The large format print rendered their faces with a shocking, hyper-realistic clarity, capturing every flaw, every line of stress, every shadow of grief. But it was the eyes that held the true horror. In the photograph, Arthur's eyes were not his usual tired, distant blue. They were wide open and filled with an intense, agonizing dread, staring directly out of the frame as if appealing for rescue. Lily's eyes, in contrast, were hard, black, and radiating a cold, focused malice that Elias had never seen in her before. And Elias himself was captured looking not at the camera, but subtly down at his own hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists on his lap. They stared at the portrait in horrified silence. It was less a portrait of remembrance and more a visual indictment. Lily was the first to react, her voice sharp with disbelief. She insisted the photographer had digitally altered the image to be dramatic, to be cruel. Arthur, however, stood absolutely still, his gaze locked on his own image. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. He didn't deny the photograph. He seemed terrified of it that Elias tried to reason, to explain the artist's claims of capturing truth. But his voice felt hollow even to him. As they stood there arguing, a slight movement caught Elias's attention. He blinked, convinced it was an optical illusion caused by the stark contrast of the large print. He looked back at the frame. Arthur, the figure in the photograph, had visibly changed. The intensity in his painted eyes was now directed not outwards, but sideways, towards the figure of Lily beside him, and the hand that was previously clenched on the figure of Lily's lap was now subtly, barely perceptibly, beginning to lift. A cold dread, far worse than the grief, seized Elias. He looked at his father, real Arthur, who suddenly let out a strangled, choked noise and backed away from the portrait. Arthur didn't explain. He simply turned and fled back into the suffocating darkness of his study. Locking the door behind him, Lily turned to Elias, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and rage, insisting they destroy the horrifying image. Elias, strangely paralyzed by a terrifying curiosity, felt an almost hypnotic pull toward the frame. He noticed the minute details of the painting, the wood grain on the sofa, the weave of the fabric and the shadow in the corner near the feet of the figures. It seemed darker, deeper, and shaped almost like a crude, small figure standing guard-dot as Lily pleaded with him. Elias reached out a trembling hand and touched the smooth, cold glass. He felt a deep, vibrating hum beneath his fingertips, and for a terrifying split second, the eyes of the painted Arthur blinked slowly, deliberately, before returning to their agonizing, open dread. Elias snatched his hand back, his heart pounding against his ribs. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that this was not merely a painting of them. It was a terrifying, living reflection of their corrupted souls, and it was watching them, waiting for its opportunity to pull the truth it captured out of the confines of the frame. The moment Elias saw the figure in the portrait blink, a primal, cold panic seized him. He didn't waste time trying to rationalize. He knew this was the terrifying truth Finch had warned him about. The portrait was not just an image. It was a psychological trap, and his father, Arthur, was already exhibiting the symptoms of its power. Arthur's reaction was the most disturbing. After retreating to his study, he didn't emerge for 2 days. Elias brought meals to the door, but they remained untouched. Lily's fear had transformed into a bitter, manic energy. She spent hours obsessively wiping down the surfaces in the living room, convinced the strange, sweet, metallic smell was emanating from the portrait itself. She suggested burning it, shattering it, burying it, but Elias, gripped by a terrible, addictive curiosity and a paralyzing fear of what the consequences of destroying the boundary might be, refused. Finch's warning echoed in his mind, "Do not move them. Do not change the arrangement." Elias decided the only way to combat the painting's influence was to confront the emotional truth it had captured. He needed to understand the terror in Arthur's painted eyes and the malice in Lily's. He started researching Finch again, desperately looking for a key, a pattern, or perhaps another victim. He found only fragmented references to the artist's unique photographic process, often described as soul capture, and a disturbing, unverified legend about a previous client family who had vanished entirely. After commissioning a similar work, the changes to the portrait accelerated. Arthur's figure, still locked in that seated posture, now had his entire body subtly tilted away from the figure of Lily. The hand that had lifted was now resting lightly, unnervingly, on the mahogany arm of the painted sofa. The fingers curled in a gesture of desperate resistance, and the painted eyes of Elias, previously fixed on his own hands, had slowly, agonizingly begun to look up, focusing on the terrible drama unfolding between his father and sister within the canvas. The climax of the week arrived on the third night. Elias awoke to a horrific, grinding sound coming from downstairs. It wasn't the sound of an object falling. It was the sound of wood scraping against wood under immense, concentrated pressure, a sound that felt wrong in the core of his bones. He grabbed the nearest thing, a heavy brass candlestick, and raced down the stairs, Lily's scream echoing behind him. The living room was plunged into shadow, lit only by the weak, silvery moonlight pouring through the bay window. Arthur was standing directly in front of the portrait, his face a grotesque mask of terror. He was not scraping at the frame. He was scraping at the wall beside the frame, his hands raw and bleeding, digging his nails into the plaster as if trying to create an escape route or a burrow. As Elias watched, horrified, Arthur slowly turned his head towards the portrait, his face utterly devoid of recognition, his eyes unfocused. He seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. Then Arthur did the unthinkable. He began to walk slowly, deliberately, towards the mahogany frame. He didn't reach out to touch it. He seemed to be walking into it. Elias rushed forward, tackling his father just inches from the cold, shimmering glass. Arthur fought him with a ferocious animal strength, grunting and weeping, desperately trying to get back to the frame. Lily arrived, screaming and sobbing, and together they wrestled Arthur to the floor, pinning his convulsing body down. Arthur's eyes, however, were fixed on the portrait, on his own fearful image. When the struggle finally subsided, leaving Arthur exhausted and whimpering on the carpet, Elias looked back at the photograph. The figure of Arthur was no longer sitting tilted on the sofa. The space where he had been was now empty, defined only by the deep impression his body had left on the velvet. The other two painted figures, Lily and Elias, were now slightly closer together. Huddled under the terrifying vacant space, the figure of Arthur was now subtly, most imperceptibly, visible outside the boundaries of the frame, in the dark, deep shadow that Finch had captured beneath the feet of the figures. Painted Arthur stood, small and blurred, looking up at the two remaining figures in the portrait, his painted expression one of absolute, eternal dread. He hadn't been pulled into the frame. He had been pulled out and was now trapped in the painted purgatory of the surrounding darkness. Elias looked down at his real father, still twitching on the floor, who seemed to have finally achieved a terrible peace. His breath was shallow, his eyes glassy, his entire body limp. He wasn't dead, but he was gone. He had withdrawn into an unreachable catatonia, becoming nothing more than an empty shell. The portrait had exacted its first terrible toll. Lily, leaning against the wall, stared at the portrait, her hands trembling. She had seen the vacant space on the sofa, and she had seen the shadow at the bottom of the frame. Her face was no longer filled with anger. It was pure, unadulterated fear, mirroring the horror in the painted figure of Arthur. Elias looked at the remaining two figures in the picture, noting the chilling minute change in the painted Lily's face. The black, malicious intensity in her eyes was now slowly, visibly beginning to shift its focus, moving from the empty space of the departed Arthur toward the figure of Elias, still sitting beside her on the painted sofa.